I'll mention that for the rest of January, we will be Zoom only. Mainly for a couple of reasons. One of them is have very, very low participation or people care to come to the in person at this time. And we also have to be working out some staffing things to make sure that it all works right too. So for everybody's convenience, I think this is going to be a better way to do it for the month.
Thanks, Mark. Well, welcome everybody to our return of the online only Beit Midrash. We are excited to be here. Rabbi Abraham and I've been talking about the ways that we could start off this series, which is, I believe the full name is something like Halakhah, Religious Observance and Daily Practice, or something to that effect. But we are gonna, kind of take a deep dive into the meaning of what is Halakhah from these different perspectives, and what are some examples of those. So we're going to start out with a text study that Rabbi Abraham is going to share just momentarily. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion, and then we're going to dive into what is the conservative and what is the reform perspective on Halakhah. How do we create Halakhah within our respective movements, and kind of go from there. So we encourage you to participate and ask questions and join the discussion.
Cool. So thank you for that. So what I thought we could do is and I think that Rabbi Berezin and I will probably pull some different things from this text, but this is a pretty famous text. So when I say that, I mean, if for the two of us, if you use this text too often when you're a rabbi and you use this text, you're going to get like slapped on the wrist, because this is kind of too simplistic to use too often. But the text actually does a lot of amazing things. So for our purposes this evening, it kind of fits the bill. So so long as our teachers are here to kind of to dare I say hit us with a ruler, it works out. It works out quite fine. So the story is of these couple of rabbis who get into a debate, and we'll get into the language. Hopefully you can see it on the shared screen. But essentially what's going on here is they get into a debate over something that is kosher or not. It doesn't really matter what the thing is, oddly enough, that is kosher. It happens that the thing they're debating is the kashrut of an oven, all right? And we don't need to get into the intricacies of the kashrut of the oven, but you're going to hear some language that talks about it being a snake. And so if you can imagine, and this is way far beyond my cooking skills, but if you can imagine a snake, or like a coil, if you will, is what I'd like you to kind of think about. So if you were to put maybe charcoal on the bottom of something and you had kind of a coil, that would be what we're talking about, kind of a snaked oven. So you could put something on the top and the coals would be on the bottom, and it would create some type of a cone, is what I want you to imagine. But for all purposes, we could be talking about the kashrut of a microwave. We could be talking about the kashrut of your GE oven at the moment. That's the crux of the conversation. So, okay. So we get into this and says basically, okay, that you've got at the very beginning, it is known about this oven of Achnai, and there is this question as to whether or not it is kosher. And what is the okay? Here we go. What is the relevance of this oven? And Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said, just bear with me for a moment until we get into the kind of the meat of it. It's characterized in the manner due to the fact the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like this snake, which also forms a coil when at rest, and deemed it impure. So essentially, what ends up happening is that the rabbis, the chachamim, the kind of the sages of the day, basically are going to determine that this oven is not kosher. The problem is there's one rabbi on the other side, as there always is at least one rabbi on the other side, saying, no, this is not the way we make, this is not correct. You guys are wrong. And by the way, that isn't a rabbinic principle. That simply could just be a Jewish principle in so many ways, okay? So it says, the sages taught on that day when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible questions in the world to support his opinion, but the rabbis did not accept his explanations from him. And failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them the following. So here's where it gets real fun, right? Here's where we get to like the hocus pocus and the Harry Potter of the Gemara, okay? So at this moment, just imagine, if you will, Rabbi Eliezer is up against the Chachamim, right? Rabbi Eliezer, one guy, the Chachamim are a group, could be 2, could be 30. And Rabbi Eliezer is saying, listen, the Halakhah is according to me, right? The oven's kosher. And so what does he do there? He says, if the Halakhah is in accordance with my opinion, that the oven is kosher, this carob tree, this like tree that's rooted in the ground will prove it. The carob tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits. Some say 400 cubits, because of course no one has to totally agree. But for the sake of argument, let's say a football field, right? And literally got up and moved. So just to be clear here, right? Rabbi Eliezer is saying, if the oven is kosher, I'm going to prove it. And the way I'm going to prove it is this tree, which trees, at least in my life experience, don't move on their own merit. This tree is going to move itself. Some say 100, others say 400 cubits. It's a pretty cool trick. The rabbi said to him, one does not cite halakhic proof from the moving of a carob tree. So to say that they were not impressed is perhaps an understatement, right? They did not care. They were not impressed. This was a parlor trick as far as they were concerned. And this carob tree moved. Fine. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the Halakhah is in accordance with my opinion, let this stream prove it. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer turns to the stream, and the water in the stream turned backward and began flowing in the opposite direction. So again, the first step was a carob tree that moved 100 cubits, 400 depending upon others. And this would be the equivalent of the Missouri River turning around and flowing the opposite direction. So Rabbi Eliezer is sitting here thinking to himself, like, what do I really have to do here to make you believe that the oven is kosher, that this thing that I believe is kosher? And let's, throw this in here at the moment. And please, people can jump out or jump out. Well, God, I hope you don't jump out, but you can jump in at any time. Is the idea of, let's assume for the moment something greater than ourselves and our own power is at play here, right? That like some God or something else is at work here in making this all happen. Okay. So what of course happens? The rabbis respond the same way, being boring and a bit uptight. They say one does not cite halakhic proof from a stream. Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the Halakhah is accordance with my opinion, then let the walls of the study hall of the Beit Midrash prove it. And the walls of the study hall leaned inward and began to fall. So let's just imagine for a moment, let's go back to our one-room schoolhouse imagination, not the beautiful buildings that we have Hebrew school in today, right? So imagine a building, my hands, no matter how I look, they don't look straight on Zoom, but imagine, if you will, they start to invert, right? They start to kind of come in, right? Because they're falling in on themselves. Okay. If the Halakhah is accordance with me, let the walls of the study house will prove it. The walls of the study house started to lean inward and began to fall. And at that moment, Rabbi Yehoshua scolded the walls. Now let's be clear here. Many a rabbi has talked to a wall, right? It's not a new phenomenon. But can you imagine a situation that could have gotten a lot more laughs there, folks, just for what that's worth, right? That was a good line. Okay. So this is why being in person is much better. But okay, so Rabbi Yehoshua turns to the walls and says, wait a second, what right do you have to be deciding or determining or having any role in Jewish law, right? He's talking literally to the walls that are falling in based on Rabbi Eliezer's kind of comment, okay? And at that point, what happens? The walls of the study, if Torah scholars are, he scolded the walls, if Torah scholars are contending with each other in matters of Halakhah, what is the nature of your involvement in this dispute? That's why I use the Harry Potter analogy, right? Because it's almost as if he's talking to the walls as if they have a say in the matter, okay? All right. Yeah, that's a funny line. The Gemara relates that the walls, it's true, Mark. It says here, the walls did not fall because of the deference due to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they did not straighten because of deference to Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning. So just to be clear, according to the story, this specific study hall, right, the walls didn't fall in, and at the same time that they didn't fall in, they also weren't straight, right? They weren't straight at deference to Rabbi Eliezer because they weren't going to go back. And they also never fell in because of the deference to Rabbi Yeshua, right? And Rabbi Yeshua is saying, listen, we don't do this. Okay. So meanwhile, let's just go back just to recap. We moved the carob tree. We made the water run backwards, right? And essentially we just made the schoolhouse walls of the Beit Midrash fall in. Okay. Now we get to, dare I say, the punchline. So Rabbi Eliezer then said to them, if the Halakhah is accordance with me, if my opinion, heaven will prove it. Now, for me, there's a read here that says that God already had a role, because I don't think that man can make a carob tree move or the water run backwards or what have you, but this is what we've got here. So it says a divine voice emerged from heaven, what is referred to, if we were looking at the Hebrew, what we referred to as a bat kol, right? Like a voice from heaven, okay? And it said, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the Halakhah is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion? Now, that's a pretty crazy statement, right? So this divine voice, this isn't like God, right? But this voice on behalf of God, maybe God's kind of consigliere, right, is speaking and saying anytime that there's a question, the Halakhah, the Jewish law is accordance, falls basically following Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Yehoshua, who just had the debate with him about the walls, stood on his feet. So he stands up and quotes what was in Deuteronomy, which is only funny because if you read the next verse, it kind of makes this verse not make any sense, but that's a whole different conversation for a different day. It says, Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written that it is not in heaven. Now, what does it mean it's not in heaven? It means that the laws are no longer decided in heaven. Now, that's a bold statement, which I think for Rabbi Berezin and I, that's where we're, I think, going to get to unpacking of what that means. But think about where that comes from. Rabbi Yehoshua is essentially saying, wait a second, I think it's cool that you moved the tree. I think it's a cool trick that you moved the water. Even the schoolhouse walls was amazing. But you know something? We don't make decisions based on what God was doing in regards to heaven. We make decisions based on what's here in this earthly realm. So the Gemara asks, what is the relevance of the phrase, it is not in heaven, which is in Hebrew, lo bashamayim hi, which is a pretty common phrase we use. What is the relevance of this praise? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah, after a majority to incline, which is essentially to say, you already gave us the gift. You already gave us this gift. And as such, now we get to decide how we're going to handle it. So let's just do two quick things. The first would be to make it the uber relevant, at least for us, which is God gave us his Torah. Right now, we're going to kind of not debate, but we're going to have a good conversation on what that means and what do we do with that. But the Torah at the moment does not hold with God. The Torah is sitting at Temple Israel. The Torahs are sitting at Bethel. They're sitting at Beth Israel. They're sitting at Chabad. They're not sitting on top of Sinai anymore. So how are we supposed to interpret this? And what's essentially being said here, Rabbi Yirmiyah is saying the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. So how many of you, by the way, have ever given your kids or your grandkids a $20 bill for Hanukkah? Maybe it's $100 with inflation nowadays, whatever. You've given them a gift of a monetary value. And they went and did something with the $100, totally legal, but they did something with the $100 that you were like, oh, God. They went and spent the $100 on that. They bought that stupid video game. They bought whatever. They went to Starbucks, whatever it would be. But the point was you gave them the $100, right? It was already given to you. It was given to them. You already gave the gift. So Rabbi Yirmiyah is essentially saying, listen, the gift of Torah was already given. What they do with it is their problem. That's their choice. And we don't simply make decisions based on the majority. Okay, fine. This is the end. Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet, which, by the way, that had to be a really cool date, like just for what it's worth. Like, people don't usually run into like Elijah the prophet walking down the street, although we can talk about that in a different class. But that must have been a really interesting interaction. And Elijah, by the way, we're told never died, right? So there's a whole question, that's another deep dive. So Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he? So what did God do at the time when Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration? So Rabbi Natan is saying to himself, of all the questions he wants to ask of all the questions Rabbi Natan wants to ask Elijah, Rabbi Natan says to him, listen, when this whole thing went down, and Rabbi Yehoshua said the Torah is not in heaven, or lo b'shamayim hi, right? It doesn't reside in heaven, right? At that moment, what did God do? Right? What happened at that moment? And Elijah said to him, Rabbi Yehoshua issued his declaration. Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. The better translation is, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Right? And that is the crux of the story. And so I'm just going to give 2 seconds and then I want to pass it back here. But for me, as a conservative rabbi, this text is almost the car keys to the ability to make certain decisions of Jewish law that may not be seen as coming directly from Sinai or God, right? Because this text is basically saying to us, wait a second, the keys to understanding Torah, the keys to unlocking the beauty of Judaism, the keys to observance, the keys to Jewish law no longer reside up here. They reside with us, right? They reside with us as kind of Klal Yisrael. That's one. And the other thing, just as a point of kind of an interesting kind of rhetorical note, Rabbi Eliezer, just to his credit, he pulls off some stunning parlor tricks, right? I mean, I think really cool tricks, but not one of them is an actual logical argument as to why the oven's kosher, right? Just to think about it for a moment, right? Like he never goes into a detailed explanation of why the oven is actually kosher, right? He just says, if it is kosher, this will happen, right? So it's an interesting idea, but what I want, if anything, if I can leave you with from my end here, and then I'm going to pass it over, is just this idea that this gives us the ability to have certain conversations that things change. And that the Torah is not a stagnant text, right? The Torah is something that's supposed to change constantly throughout time. It's not a static document. The words may be, but our understanding of it isn't. And if that was the case, we wouldn't need to reread it every single year, right? We could read it once, call it done, and read something else. So, Rabbi Berezin, I'll pass it back to you, but I hope that I did that decent. Okay.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. And, I think that I don't want to repeat a lot of what Rabbi Abraham just said, but in essence, as liberal Jews, there are things that our movements disagree on and how we read into those, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I read very similarly as he does, in that this gives us permission to say that things are not fully written until we as human beings experience life in our world in this moment and bring those experiences to Torah. And therefore we have a say in our ability to shape Torah and shape law to fit into what it is that our life needs it to be. And there are certain ways that I think that this gives permission to do that, right? Because as Rabbi Abraham said, it wasn't just given and therefore nothing changes over thousands of years, because that is not a practical way to live our lives. And if you look at how things are done in the evolutions in humanity, that would be impossible. And so part of Torah, we call it Eitz Chaim Hi, right? This is the tree of life. And the same way that trees are living and growing and they continually sprout new roots and new branches, right? To give us shelter and give us comfort and security and protection. That is how Torah operates as well. And it gives us the permission to say that, what was maybe once an argument that made sense might not make sense anymore. And therefore we have the ability to reach consensus to change the law in accordance to what, is meaningful for our lives. And I think that this text, while it is correct, you cannot overuse it because there's so many times when it could be appropriate. It's kind of like the Shehechianu, right? It is super appropriate for many different things, right? And so it's hard to not overuse it. But it really does help us to set the stage for what it means to be liberal Jews in our interpretation of how we bring Judaism into our world and into our lives today. So I guess I want to open it up to, does anybody else have any questions or thoughts on how this could influence our understanding of Jewish law and Torah?
I just wanted to share with everybody, in case you have not been inside Beth Israel, that this verse in Deuteronomy and the verse that follows it are above the ark. And there was 2 stained glass windows designed by Marty Schukert that say it is not in the heavens, it's not out of our reach, and it's not in the seas, it's not out of our reach there. And I think that's what the next verse says, right? Something about, yeah.
We read it on Yom Kippur, actually.
Yeah, but that's what's on the wall above the ark at Beth Israel.
Beautiful. Thanks, Sherry.
Right. It's a real, and what's interesting is, and I don't want to speak at all for clergy who are not, present, but it's an interesting thing because the question really becomes where is that? I'll take this off of the shared screen here for a second, but where is that line, right? And that's, I think, the real understanding, right, of where things are. So all the more so that it would be at an Orthodox synagogue, perhaps, right? But the question becomes is, where is the line where we don't cross that is the kind of the tradition versus where is the line where we feel like we can touch new things, right? The Orthodox movement, regardless of this isn't this is simply a factual statement. Number of years back, there was a rabbi, I believe, at the early part of the 20th century, who basically said anything new is forbidden, right? And that concept was done because they were worried, right? They were worried that they needed to remain, this text needed to remain static. Our observance, in some ways, needed to remain static. And so the concept of it not being heaven, or not being in heaven, I think kind of gives, Rabbi Berezin, gives myself, gives the other kind of clergy in town, and gives us as Jews, right, the ability to be able to look at certain texts and to say, wait, how do we grapple with this? I think the question where we may even disagree just becomes like, how far can we go to grapple or to accommodate, maybe is even a good word, right? Like how far can we go to do that? But I'm curious any other thoughts or questions, because this text is certainly one of, I think, for one of my favorites. I think it brings out a lot of different things.
But aren't there things in the Torah that are definite? Like you can't just, they are what they are, and I don't think there's interpretation of it.
Give me an example.
I can't.
So I'll give you an example, but I'm going to tell you that I don't observe it, which of course is not a good thing, right? So shotness, right? You don't mix wool and linen. If you live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, there are certain tailors that you can drive, or dry cleaners, and you can drive by the dry cleaner when you walk by or drive by in Manhattan. There's a sign in the window, or there used to be when I was in rabbinical school, and said we check for shotness. Now I can tell you how much money they probably charged to check for shotness. It was not worth the check. But that being said, shotness is a biblical prohibition that you don't mix wool and linen. There isn't much interpretation. The question is whether or not we observe said law, but there isn't much interpretation to it. I would say there are a lot of other things that actually there's a pretty big hole, that we could talk about. But I do agree, Elaine, there are certain things that are absolutes, but they're not as many as you would think. In my humble opinion, there are not as many as you would think. I think the list is pretty small. I mean, even kashrut. What does it mean to boil a kid in its mother's milk, right? I mean, even if the rabbis didn't make it clear, we wouldn't really know how to understand that. So, I mean, that's just where I'm at. But that's just one way to parse it out.
Well, the question is, what what gives the rabbinic authority the authority to say, this is a halakhah and that's it?
I think that's a good question that we're going to dive into, right? Like, where is the authority to make changes or to say that, like, as Rabbi Abraham was saying, like, what is the boundary line? How much change can one make to, and where do we have to stay firm and say that the boundary line remains? And that is an important part of, and I think a distinction in some ways between, the major movements of Judaism is their understanding and about Halakhah and how we are bound to it or not bound to it and where that boundary line lies.
Yes, Rabbi may recall, I raised a legal question having to do with corporations, which is corporations, generally speaking, about 400 or 500 years ago became a concept in Western literature, legal thought. So a question came up, and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, a leading authority, said, we can't, the Halakhah only knows partnerships. It does not know corporations. The only way you can solve that problem is to have a Sanhedrin, which of course everybody knows would probably be impossible. So where is this idea that the authority stops there and that's it?
I think there are two places to go. I want to punt a little bit to back to Rabbi Berezin to kind of will keep us moving in some other the concept of how the law committees work and things like that to kind of talk about how we make some of these decisions. But Steve, I don't want to speak to specifically maybe to that exact example, but maybe on a macro level, the first Mishnah just on Pirkei Avot, which is in many Sidurim, you can open up to Pirkei Avot, right? It's kind of just what have you. But the very first Mishnah said that Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great assembly. And that's kind of one of the lineage traditions, right? The other was the fact that when you think about after the Second Temple Judaism, following the destruction of the Second Temple and the idea of Yavna, Judaism became what we do as Judaism today because of, I say rabbis, I'm not looking at us. It was a totally different generation of what rabbi meant. But they became the ones that were supposedly the ones that were educated on these issues to make decisions. It didn't mean they should be deciding a whole host of other decisions, right? You should never be kind of going outside of your, maybe your lane. But on these kind of questions, that was where they were given the ability to make it. I do wonder, and I wonder, Rabbi Berezin, if you could kind of speak to this in the reform movement, but I guess the question becomes is, when questions of religious law are decided in a reform synagogue, how are they decided between the kahal, between like the congregation and the I can speak to the Reconstructionists a little bit as a break off of conservative, but I'm curious from a reform perspective to Steve's question, how are those decisions made?
Rabbi, I have a question. Okay, you don't ride on Saturday, right? According to Halakhah. Then the conservative movement came out with the rule that, okay, you can ride directly to the synagogue and directly home, no stops in between. That's the rule that the group came out with, right? Okay. So they made a ruling for that. Well, you know what's happened with that.
Yeah. But there is nothing in Torah that talks about a car. So I don't mean to, but I mean, Elaine, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think there's a dilemma. You're absolutely right.
But my thing is, it was a rule for years. And then the conservative movement came out and they clarified that rule with how to handle it by going direct and then back home.
Right. So
there's also nothing in the Torah that's about electricity either.
Well, right, which is, I don't feel so bad about driving a Tesla. But that being said, right, yeah. So here's the quick answer for you, and then I really want to get to the differences between the movements. But Elaine, to your specific question, and this is being recorded, so I want to be very, very, very careful. So that decision was not, in my opinion, based on Jewish law. That decision was being made on demographics. So I'm going to use my grandparents of blessed memory as a great example. So I don't know that my grandparents of blessed memory, my mom's parents actually cared whether they drove to synagogue or not. Let me be very clear. But what I can tell you is that my parents' synagogue was in an urban center. It was in Washington, D.C. proper. And it moved to the suburbs, right? Some of you have noticed that your synagogues have moved from, east to west, right? That's not so uncommon. And your homes may have actually been near the synagogues when they were originally built, right? So that being said, that was a pretty common thing to have happen. And the rabbis at the time, I believe, a certain group, not all of them, a certain group felt that if they didn't say something to the extent of you're allowed, living still in the city, because in the urban center, you're still allowed to drive to your now suburban synagogue, they were going to lose certain people. Now, do I have a problem if there are certain, so that's a social, that's a phenomenon. That was not something steeped in Jewish law to make that decision. In my opinion, it was done. It is what it is. The ramifications are what they are. It is what it is. From my experience of 11 years in the pulpit, most Jews do not need a rabbinic permission to do something that's a violation of Jewish law. So therefore, I don't think that many Jews needed a permission slip to drive to synagogue as if that was it. Just like most Jews don't need a permission slip to go to a restaurant and eat a cheeseburger, right? They don't call me ahead of time. They do it. And that is what it is. So I think, Elaine, to your point, absolutely. That was something that if we could go back in time, we would. And there are other things I think that we would go back in time and do as well. But I think for the moment, let's take a little bit of a step back and kind of just see how the decisions are made. Whether they're made correctly or not is maybe a different question. Berezin, so I'm curious because from my own knowledge, if somebody comes to you, to Rabbi Stoller, and says, we have a predicament, this is what our question is X. How do those decisions get made in a Reform congregation?
So it really depends on the congregation in many ways. And what I will say is that, usually the rabbinic leadership, has to, the clergy in general, not just the rabbinic leadership, but the clergy, team, who's often includes cantors and rabbis together, try and make a decision that we feel like will benefit the community and feels in line with the values of the community. But oftentimes we look to the Reform responsa. So for those on this call who might be a little confused about what decisions we're talking about and how, and like whether that decision is good or not good, the way that after that text from Pirkei Avot that Rabbi Abraham shared with us is that eventually we get to questions where there is not discussion about electricity or cars or things like that at a certain point. And so we have to be able to make decisions about things that come up in life that we want to understand where Judaism falls on that spectrum. And the way that for a very long time that has been done is this mechanism called responsa. And responsa is the act of posing a question to a group of people or a rabbi, depending on your movement and who you hold to be the authority. For a long time, it was a rabbi who led a community, and I think that is still the case in some cases. In the Reform movement, it is a body of rabbis that come together to make the decisions on behalf of the community, or to offer suggestions, I will say, rather not make the decisions. And so we look at the Reform responsa that has come out, and I'd like to share just a little bit about that to kind of give an understanding. I'm going to, and Rabbi Abraham has just shared the links to both our community's responses. So I'm going to read just a section of this to help us give a grounding so that I can then answer Rabbi Abraham's question. So according to Rabbi Mark Wachowski, who was the head of the CCAR, Central Conference of American Rabbis Responsa Committee, which is what the Reform Rabbinate, we all belong to, the CCAR. He led that committee for many, many years. And so he has a really incredible knowledge and depth and wisdom of his understanding of Halakhah. And so what he writes in his work, which is called Jewish Living, A Guide to Contemporary Reform Practice about Halakhah, is that what he says is that Halakhah its continued vitality in Reform Judaism links us to the religious expression of other Jews, uniting us with them as part of a community whose history spans many, many generations. This does not mean, however, that rabbinic law and its literature function for us in exactly the same way as they function for other Jews. Just as we have our own particular experience as a modern Jewish religious movement, so do we have our own unique approach to Halakhah, which emerges from that experience. So basically, it says that first and foremost, Reform responsa are not authoritative, which is a difference than in other movements. The answers they reach are in no way binding or obligatory upon those who ask the questions, upon other Reform Jews, or upon the movement as a whole. Our responsa do not claim this practice of authority because, however important it may be to the definition of our religious practice, we do not regard Halakhah as a process which yields mandatory conclusions. In Reform Judaism, religious decisions are arrived at by individuals or communities who take into account all the factors that seem relevant to them and then choose accordingly. Decisions are not imposed upon individuals or community, quote, from the outside, whether by rabbis or lay leaders. Thus, our responsa writers have always described their work as advisory, emphasizing the right of the readers to reject or modify the answers as they see fit. So that's a really important distinction for our community because when we arrive at what we decide as communal practice, it is in consultation with our community members and understanding that what we do as an institution may be different from the congregants on their own, right? Because every person has the autonomy to make those decisions. Now, in our movement, those, there are things that are taken into consideration. So that includes the generations and the scholarship of Talmud and the codes and all of the things that have come before us and all of the ways that we have looked at that literature. But it also includes such things as, gender equality and our commitment to gender equality and, moral equality of all different people. And things like the desirability of religious innovation and creativity, and the ways that we look at that and uphold those values that help guide our decisions in the same ways that the history and the literature of generations past have guided. So when we look at those decisions, that like all together, that's how we make decisions as a community. So whether those are questions about whether we serve, ranch salad dressing with our burgers at temple, right? If we're, or whether we display an American flag and an Israeli flag on the bima, or whether we, all different kinds of answers. These are questions that the community can pose and think about and then come to the conclusions together as we make those decisions. And that process is led by the clergy, but it takes into account the values of the community. And I'm curious to hear how that is similar and different to Rabbi Abraham's process.
So it's really interesting. So just to make sure that I'm on the same page. So in theory, I mean, in a bigger city where there could be two different Reform synagogues, you could have two different policies on the ranch dressing question.
Sure. Yes. And so the same way is like one of the things that has come up before are things like, planting a tri-faith garden on Shabbat, or doing a Habitat for Humanity project on Shabbat instead of seeking a different day, And so in a different community, you may have different answers, and you might see groups of people participating differently with regards to their own practices, whether it be ranch dressing or whether it be, taking a team to Habitat for Humanity, or taking a group to march in Pride, or something that happens on, Shabbat, for example. So each community could answer that question differently.
Well, how could it be said, Rabbi, that you have any standards?
Well, wait, hold on. Wait, Steve, hold on. Because if you're going to ask that question, you're going to have to ask it of me first, just as well. So let me give the conservative understanding, and then we'll come back to that, to where you're coming from. So, okay, so that's really interesting. So there's to kind of just to hear you, that it's a conversation amongst basically where the congregation is at, and the rabbis being in touch with and in tune with where their congregants are at to be able to fuel, what have you. You could have a more traditional Reform synagogue down the street where X and Y wouldn't hold, and one synagogue down the street where, hey, things are a little bit more, understanding, or whatever the right word would be. It's not a liberal or conservative, but it's,
just a different interpretation. And of course, that depends on the clergy and their leadership and how they, choose to, and the congregation's way of making those decisions comes into play as well.
Fascinating. Okay, so really quickly, I want to just give, before I give the conservative answer, I want to give the Reconstructionist answer. I don't want to speak for Orthodoxy, but Reconstructionist I can speak to only because it was a break off of the conservative movement. So for those of you who have heard of Mordechai Kaplan, of course, taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He also was the same person who started Young Israel. So he kind of had his hand in both the Reconstructionist movement, which some see as being like uber liberal. Ironically, not. It's more of it's a break off of conservative. And he was also involved in the Orthodox world. Rabbi Kaplan really wanted to see his daughter be bat mitzvahed, which was one of the major reasons he left the conservative movement in general. But that being said, the Reconstructionist movement, in his kind of opus, or his magnum of Judaism and civilization, the understanding was that the rabbis were kind of like cruise directors. So in basically what would happen would be is that they would be the understanding or the knowledgeable Jew in the room, if you will. But if the congregation kind of came to the rabbi and said, listen, to try Berezin's example, we want to be able to have hamburgers and we want to have their dairy ranch dressing example, right? This is just where we're at. The rabbi wouldn't kind of make an excuse for why this is or isn't okay, if you will. That would just be, okay, like this is where we're at, right? This is where I'm going to make sure that we're living in some level in accordance with that, and I'm going to make that work, right? I'm going to make it so that we can still play chess or checkers, and I'm going to tell that narrative so it works. And so he or she, as the rabbi of a Reconstructionist synagogue, really was trying to make sure that the congregation felt like they were it wasn't part of, but that their home practice, or that the practice that they felt was right for where they were as a community, was the most important thing. It wasn't necessarily that there was a bar we should be aspiring to. It was wherever we're at on that kind of level was the right place to be. Okay, so that being said, the conservative movement still falls under a model where they consider the rabbi to be the Mara d'Atra, which is to say the kind of the rabbinic decisor of Jewish law. That's kind of a little bit of a misnomer in how actually things work, but that is the understanding of how things are done. And so I'm gonna show you in a moment. I'm gonna share with you one of a paper, not because of the content of the paper, but more for the fact of the disclaimer that is always there on all of these papers. But the basic idea would be is if a question comes to me of Jewish law, for which is something that I know an answer to, that answer we look, I go back, I look at the sources, and a decision is made. if that question is something that I think has ramifications for the greater good of the congregation, and I'm worried about where things are, I will get us consensus of where the congregation is at. So for many of you who are involved with Bethel over the past 10, 11 years, a great example, a couple could be our decision about the cemetery. Our conversation could be about live streaming on Shabbat, way before COVID, by the way, was a conversation. These were conversations that I went to our ritual committee, to our religious life committee, and then took to the board and said, hey, what do you want to do? Now, one of the, and by the by, I think the important thing to kind of point out here, and I wonder about this for the reform movement, how, if it would be different at all, is that while the question was asked of me, when we got to the board meeting to make a decision, I basically said, listen, I need you to understand, this is where I'm falling out on the decision. But had the decision been a residing no, right? Had the decision been something like, I don't think that doing live streaming is acceptable, then the congregation would have been in an interesting place about what to do. Right? I hope that makes a little bit of sense, right? So the congregation being in a place where they came to me and said, Stephen, what do you think about live streaming? And I said, I think that makes perfect sense for where we are and for people who are homebound and everything else, and we're not turning it on and off. It makes perfect sense. Well, then I can put it in the congregation's hand, in the board's hands, and say, hey, listen, make a decision. You decide what you think is best, because I was okay with either side of the coin. If I was adamantly against and didn't feel like I thought it was a violation of Jewish law for us to do it, then that would be a different dilemma, right? They would need to be able to say, hey, listen, we're going to go a different direction with clergy, right? I mean, and by the way, there are plenty of synagogues that do that, right? Clergy have to have a backbone to be able to stand up and say, this is where my line is, and look themselves in the mirror. And so that would be a great example. The other place we go to, where Rabbi Berezin beautifully spoke about, just as they have in the movement of the reform movement, is that we have something called the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. And this is a committee that writes papers on major questions of Jewish law. Now, some of those questions you and I may not think are major. I may not even think are major, but they are questions that are asked of local community rabbis who don't necessarily have the resources and the time to be able to research what is the right answer here. And so they kind of send it up the chain, if you will. And this group of rabbis ends up kind of taking it on. And if they think it's worthy, they will do a lot of investigation and write very lengthy and thoughtful papers on this question. So just really quickly, just to kind of share this, just to hopefully it'll probably make you laugh. Is it this one that you're looking at? Is a really recent question. There's been a lot of talk recently about fake meat or lab grown meat, right? So what is, may cultured meat, also known as in vitro, clean, or lab grown meat, be considered kosher? So not necessarily stuff like beyond burgers and stuff like that, right? Not that stuff that's actually lab grown animal, right? And what does that determine? So we're not going to go through that paper. I'm less interested in it, and trust me, don't understand the biology of it. But what I want to show you is one very important line. Okay, so that line is right here. And it says, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly provides guidance in matters of halakhah for the conservative movement. The individual rabbi, however, is the authority for the interpretation and application of all matters of halakhah. So that is, for us, it is a poor get out of jail free card, but that is the get out of jail free card that we as conservative rabbis use when asked a question, and if we don't follow it. Because there are papers, by the way, that you could come to me you can read online. And you could say, Stephen, why don't we do this? Or how come we do this? And my response would be this is the moment is where we're at. And maybe that will change. So it's an interesting kind of place to find oneself. And to Rabbi Berezin's point, if there were two conservative synagogues in Omaha, I would venture to guess that you would have two different observances of certain things. I never grew up, just for whatever it's worth, I'll throw out one that I think is funny, that I happen to love and adore, but something that was not part of my upbringing. When I came to Bethel as the assistant rabbi, we already used music on Friday night, right? Musical instrumentation to me is not something we do on Shabbat. That was never like in my psyche, because I grew up at synagogues where people sang, like everyone sang. And if you have that, you don't really need a lot of musical instrumentation because the room is vibrating. It's because of the people singing. The music adds something to it. Don't get me wrong, but it's not always necessary. And based on my understanding of how I understood Jewish law, that wasn't part of it. That being said, Bethel was a place where that was part of the custom, right? And the custom of the place changes where a rabbi can be at. But that's where you have to kind of make certain decisions and be able to, I think, maybe toe the line and be able to do that. It's not a simple thing to be able to do, but it is something that I think is really important. And we base all of it on that kind of earlier text that we look at, which was that we're making the best decisions that we can for the communities that we live in, for where they're at, while at the same time being able to look ourselves in the mirror and look at our Torah and the way we understand Torah, so that we're being legitimate and we're being authentic. Now, we may differ in what that means, right? But I don't consider anything that the temple does or doesn't do to be less authentic in its Jewish response to what we do at Bethel. I may not always understand, right? And vice versa, right? But it's not a lack of disrespect or authenticity. It's a fact that it's more of a level of curiosity, because they play the game differently, right? And that's okay, right? We play it differently than the Orthodox movement. So I hope that was at least a little bit of an understanding for us.
But how can that be said to be in any standards, particularly Rabbi Berensen's thing? Where are the standards, if any? Or it's what each individual feels is right for him or her, and that's it.
I mean, there are boundaries, right? Like we believe in one God, right? That is not something, like there are ways that we can, create boundary lines. There's just differences in boundary lines for us. So while in other movements, for example, I would not be considered a rabbi, the Reform movement 50 years ago said, started ordaining women. This is the 50th year of women in the rabbinate. Rabbi Sally Priesand was ordained 50 years ago. And the act of saying that, that going back to the oven of that we talked about, and whether it's kosher or not, and that, lo bashamayim, we have the ability to say that our reading of Jewish law and where we are as a community needs to take into account what values we hold. And egalitarianism is one of those things. And so therefore, women can be ordained and should be treated as equals and therefore and become rabbis. There are differences, and it's not to say that we do not have standards, right? There are plenty of times when if somebody comes and says, like, what is the Jewish viewpoint on this? I'm still held as an authority on Jewish practice and Jewish ritual and Jewish law. I just don't make that decision on behalf of other people. So while, my personal practice may differ in what it doesn't mean that my personal interpretation is different or better than other people's. I may choose.
Rabbi, excuse me, there's a big difference between personal interpretation and a standard that everybody is.
Right, but Steve, hold on. I guess the question becomes that the standard is being set by their understanding of the not, I say there, no different than our. My interpretation, the standard that is set in the conservative movement is based on our understanding of the divinity of Torah, right? Let's just call it what it is. And so to make a decision is based on that. If you believe the Torah was handed down by God on the top of a mountain and it was handed as it was, which is a perfectly fine way to 100%, then your understanding of what can and cannot be changed is going to be very limited. If your understanding is that this is a history book that talks about our people's history, but just because, let's be clear, just because they apparently didn't mix milk and meat, or just because the rabbis of another era understood that, that may not be how one movement decides that they want to create their community and ritual practice, right? And so, you know, the Reform movement, this was, I mean, 20 years ago, their motto, which I don't know if it worked or not, but their motto was choice through knowledge. Now, I mean, that could actually ironically be the motto of the conservative movement today, right?
I think that, you know, to kind of go off of that, like what I was going to say is that, you know, in fact, Rabbi, I think it's Mordecai Kaplan coined the phrase that like Jewish law, you know, has a vote, but not a veto. And I think that that is the mantra of the Reconstructionist movement. But in many ways, it applies to more than that. And that like that Jewish law, like there are way, like it's the way that we as a community interpret Jewish law. And so I'm going to share my screen for just a moment with you. If I can find the right thing, hold on. Can everybody see this? Okay.
Now we can.
Yeah,
now
okay.
we can.
So for example, this is a responsa about flags on the bima. The question is, it's customary in many synagogues to place flags on the bima, both the national flag and the state of Israel. Is it appropriate for Reform synagogues to exalt national symbols at the same rank as symbols of Jewish worship? Specifically, does this practice border upon idolatry, avodah zarah? So then it goes through and like Rabbi Abraham said, now this question may not seem to be a huge ordeal, right? But in fact, it is something you see customarily in lots of synagogues around the country. So it goes through and it decided to answer this question. It looks at the sources. It looks at Jewish texts. It looks at, you know, Mishnah. It looks at Ezekiel. It looks at, and it in fact goes into Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, his view of Halakhah, and lots of different ways of interpreting that. It doesn't make a decision based on deciding that I think this and it has no place. What we attempt to do is to learn as much as possible, choice through knowledge, understand what Judaism has said and continues to say in other ways and in other places, and then decide if that still feels like where we are as a community and make the decision from that knowledge.
Right. I would only add to that for our movement, you know, Stephen, I think to others, and then maybe we'll kind of call it here, but is, if anything, and this is, you know, by the way, me sitting here as a knee-deep conservative rabbi, if there's a greater hypocrisy, it lies with us. You know, because the interesting thing about the conservative movement is we do our very best to have our cake and eat it too. We want to look. You know, I think David Weiss Halivni once made the comment when he was teaching at the seminary prior to the ordination of women. When the ordination of women changed at the seminary, he left. But David Weiss Halivni, who is a prolific teacher of Talmud, of Gemara, he once made a comment in his book, The Sword and the Stone. He said, the people I pray with, I can't talk to, and the people I talk to, I can't pray with. And so you just think about that for a moment, right? You know, he doesn't get along with those people, the people that he prays with. And so that's the kind of the understanding, which is to say that I would like to live in a Jewish world for me as a conservative rabbi where the folks are keeping kosher and they're asking me questions of this and that and but that's just not the way that the majority of the questions and the concerns come to us. And so when we make certain decisions, I think we do have standards. The problem becomes is we have to, they move, they're organic, and they move on each and every single issue. You know, 20 years ago, just in the Cherry, we'll let you have the last question here. 20 years ago, there would never have been a question for a conservative synagogue about non-Jewish family members or parents on the bima. This never would have had a conversation. It wouldn't have been a question. And there's a paper that was written, I think it was 5 years ago, but after we made a change at the synagogue, I didn't care that there was a paper or not. But there's a paper written by David Booth, who was a rabbi in Palo Alto, California, that literally wrote about the permissibility of non-Jews to open up the ark. Like, so, how amazing. Hold on, Sherry's got one. Hold on it. Sherry, go for it.
Well, a couple of things. When I raised my hand initially, it was when Elaine brought up the question about driving to synagogue. So I remember back in the 50s when that ruling came out, and I put 666, but I think there's more than 18 people on the Jewish Law and Standards Committee. But I think it was a very split vote. And I remember all the years that we studied with you, Responsa, in the conservative movement, that there could be split movements and there could be three specific things. The other issue is what you just brought up. I remember when, our kids all had their bar and bat mitzvahs at temple over a 12-year period of time. And from the oldest to the youngest, the oldest one, there was one family where the father was not Jewish. And the discussion after the meeting with the mother of the bar mitzvah boy talking to Rabbi Brooks, what can the father do? By the time I got to Chelsea 12 years later, at least half of the kids in her class had one non-Jewish parent, and the rules had changed. So it's just very different. So I just remember when the driving thing came up. And again, having grown up 6 blocks away from the conservative synagogue, and there was no parking lot where I grew up anyway, it was irrelevant because nobody could park there even if they wanted to drive.
So Rabbi, very quick to Steve's point. Number one, the Torah says at the end that Hashem or God said, look, there will be other people who come and interpret the Torah that I have just given you. And that gives opportunity for other interpretations. As far as standards are concerned, this is going to sound funny, pizza. We all like pizza. But the way we have it designed right now with Reform, Conservative, Reconstruction, and Orthodox, you can go to different pizza places, get a pizza, and have different recipes. Not only that, you can have a square pizza, a thin pizza, a thick pizza. So as Jews, the way the Halakhah is interpreted as a result of the Torah saying there will be people who come by and interpret it, it gives us the options and choice, what kind of pizza we want or what kind of a shul we want and how we want to observe our Judaism. And I would wrap it up by saying it's the same thing with Chinese food. Chinese food has a standard. You can go to different Chinese restaurants, as long as they're kosher, and have different Chinese food. So that would be my recap of what we talked about.
Sure. I guess I just want to, so thank you both. I just want to make sure I want to be very clear. I think there is a level of, and just to kind of wrap up here, I think there would be a difference of opinion between the two of us on how much autonomy our congregants should have versus how much they do have. I also think that if an Orthodox rabbi was sitting with us, that autonomy would even be less. So no, not knocking it. I'm saying I think your analogy, the metaphor is great. I'm simply saying that they may not prescribe to there being pizza. Like pizza may not exist, right? So I think that matters a great deal. I think at the end of the day, I think the most important thing that we can do, all the more so living in a community like Omaha, that only really has one ice cream flavor of each denomination, if you will, although they're all delicious in their own merit, is that it's ask yourself the curiosity question before you ask the judgment question. So how we understand Jewish law, like when I sat with Rabbi Azriel, when we were going through the policy of making the change on our cemetery policy, I was a bit surprised at how thoughtful the change was, at Temple. Now, I don't know procedurally, and I don't really care, but when we spoke about it, it wasn't as if it was simply fait accompli. Well, of course we're going to do this, right? There was a conversation to be had. Even his policy, when the time came for interfaith, there was certainly numbers, and those were factors. I don't think he would disagree with that, but it was a process, right? It was a thoughtful, organic process that happens with law in general, and so that's where we're at to kind of make those decisions. And I think that our movements are doing the best that they can with a world that is constantly changing. So that being said, I really appreciate and always love Rabbi Berezin teaching with you. So I hope everybody got something out of tonight, and we'll always be around for
Thank you. It's been great getting to teach with you too. I love when we get to start with a common text and find the ways that we can differ and agree. And I think that it's been really, hopefully a good discussion for all of you to see that there are just different ways of looking at things. And part of the great part about Omaha is that there are so many people who find their homes in all 3, sometimes 4 of our institutions. And that allows people to explore differently and see the things that are the same and things that are different depending on where you go. So thank you for coming to learn with us. As a reminder, as Mark said at the beginning, we're going to continue to be online for the month of January. So next week you will have different teachers, I believe. And thanks for studying with us tonight.
And three quick things. First, thank you very much, rabbis, for a very interesting and thoughtful discussion. I really enjoyed it very much. Second one is next week is be fruitful and multiply, but what if we can't? That's the second session for that same topic. And then the third point is if you ever want to go and catch up or see again any of the sessions, they are available on YouTube. You can go to the Federation's YouTube channel and search it that way. Probably the easiest way to do it is if you would go to the reminder emails that I send out. There's a button there that you can press and you'll get a whole list of them, but you can just choose some very quickly. So thank you all very much.